She bought the lighthouse because no one else would. $50. That was the price printed on the auction sheet, handwritten beneath a photograph so faded it could have been anything. A barn, a silo, a forgotten church steeple rising from the fog. But she knew what it was. She had driven past it once, years ago, on a day when the road along the coast had been the only route left open after the bridge flooded. She remembered the shape of it against the gray sky, tall and narrow, leaning slightly as if listening to the sea. She remembered thinking it looked like something that had once mattered, and now waited to be told it could stop. $50. She counted the bills twice before sliding them across the counter, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from the weight of what she was doing. The clerk did not look up. When he stamped the paper, slid a key across the surface, and moved on to the next file, as if transferring ownership of a condemned lighthouse on a stretch of coast that most people had forgotten was the least remarkable thing he would do that day. She picked up the key and held it in her palm, feeling the rust against her skin. It was heavier than it should have been, or perhaps her hand was simply tired from holding on to things that never quite held her back. Her name was Lenora, though most people who still spoke to her called her Nora, and the number of people who still spoke to her had been shrinking for longer than she cared to measure. She was 39 years old. She had 2 children, a daughter of 11 named Celia, and a son of 7 named Martin, and she had been raising them alone for 3 years. Ever since the morning she woke to find the other side of the bed empty, the closet half cleared, and a note on the kitchen counter written in handwriting she barely recognized. The note said nothing useful. It offered no apology, no explanation, no forwarding address. It simply said, "I can't do this anymore." She had read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer she never opened again. The years since had been a slow compression, each month pressing tighter than the last. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3 when the season allowed. Mornings at the elementary school cafeteria, where she served breakfast to children who reminded her of her own. Evenings at the laundromat on Birch Street, folding other people's clothes while her children did homework on a plastic chair beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects. On weekends, she cleaned houses for families who lived in the kind of homes she had once imagined owning. Homes with second floors and backyards and doors that locked without effort. She did not resent them. She did not have the energy for resentment. What she had instead was a quiet, persistent understanding that her life had become a series of transactions. Time exchanged for money, money exchanged for survival, survival exchanged for the hope that tomorrow might ask slightly less of her than today. The apartment where they lived sat above a hardware store on the east side of town, 3 rooms connected by a hallway so narrow that Celia and Martin could not pass each other without turning sideways. The rent was late more often than it was on time, and the landlord, a man named Birch, who owned 4 buildings on the same block, had begun leaving notices on her door with a regularity that felt less like business and more like punishment. She read each one carefully, folded it, and added it to the stack on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker that no longer worked. The stack grew taller each month, a paper monument to obligations she could see but could not meet. Her children did not complain. That was the part that hurt most. Celia had learned to make meals from what was available without asking why certain things were missing. Martin had stopped requesting new shoes, even though the ones he wore had been passed down twice already and no longer fit either foot comfortably. They moved through their days with a patience that no child should have needed to learn. She and Lenora watched them with a mixture of pride and guilt that sat in her chest like a stone she could neither swallow nor cough up. She had not planned to attend the county auction. The flyer had been pinned to the bulletin board at the laundromat, half hidden beneath a notice for a church bake sale and a lost cat poster that had been there so long The ink had faded to the color of old tea. She saw it while folding a stranger's sheets, her eyes drifting as they sometimes did when her hands moved without instruction. County property auction. Lots sold as is. The words meant little to her at first. She did not have money for property. She did not have money for most things. But the date was a Saturday, and the children would be at her mother's house, and the idea of spending a morning somewhere other than a laundromat or a kitchen or an apartment that smelled of damp walls felt like permission she had not known she needed. The auction was held in the basement of the county courthouse, a room with low ceilings and metal chairs arranged in rows that reminded her of a church without windows. The air smelled of old carpet and burnt coffee. A dozen people sat scattered among the chairs, most of them men in work jackets, who studied printed sheets, with the focus of people who had done this before. Lenora took a seat near the back, feeling immediately out of place, as if she had wandered into someone else's appointment and was now too embarrassed to leave. The lots were called one by one, parcels of land no one wanted, a flooded basement on a residential street, a strip of roadside property tangled in easement disputes. Each drew brief, disinterested bids from the men in the front rows, and each was sold within minutes. She watched the process without participating, telling herself she was only observing, only learning, only filling the hours until she needed to collect her children. Then the auctioneer read the next lot. Lighthouse structure and adjacent parcel, located at the end of Cray Point Road, sold as is, minimum bid $50. The photograph appeared on the screen behind him, and the room went quiet. Not with interest, but with dismissal. The image showed a tower of gray stone rising from a rocky bluff, its upper windows shattered, its exterior streaked with salt and weather. The land around it was overgrown, choked with brush, and the skeletal remains of a wooden fence that had surrendered decades ago. A secondary structure, barely visible behind the tower, sagged under the weight of its own roof. The auctioneer read the description without inflection. The property had been in county possession for 11 years, following the death of its last private owner. Multiple attempts to sell had failed. There were no utilities, no road maintenance beyond the county line, and no structural guarantees. The lighthouse had been decommissioned in 1971 and had not been occupied since 1986. It was, by every measurable standard, worthless. No one bid. The auctioneer waited. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that makes people shift in their seats and study their shoes. Lenora did not know why she raised her hand. Later, when people asked her, she would offer different explanations depending on who was asking and how much patience she had for their judgment. To her mother, she said it was instinct. To her friend Diane, she said it was the only thing she could afford. To herself, in the privacy of her own thoughts, she admitted something closer to the truth. She raised her hand because the lighthouse looked the way she felt, abandoned, overlooked, still standing for reasons no one could explain. $50. The auctioneer brought down the gavel with a sound that carried more finality than the amount deserved. She signed the papers at a folding table near the exit, her hand steadier than it had been at the counter. The clerk handed her a key and a manila envelope containing a survey map, a deed transfer form, and a single-page disclosure that listed the property's known deficiencies. The list was long. She folded it without reading past the first paragraph and slid it into her bag, beside the emergency inhaler she carried for Martin and the granola bar she kept for Celia's after-school hunger. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, and the sidewalk shone with the remains of an earlier rain. She stood there for a moment, the key in her pocket, the weight of what she had done settling into her slowly, like water soaking into dry ground. She had bought a lighthouse, a condemned, abandoned, unreachable lighthouse at the end of a road that barely existed. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it made her feel something she had not felt in years, a sensation so unfamiliar it took her several minutes to name it. Possibility. Not certainty, not even hope in the way other people use the word, but the faint, stubborn sense that she had stepped outside the pattern of her life, even if only for a moment. The reaction from others was swift and ungenerous. Her mother, a woman whose love expressed itself primarily through worry, called the same evening. Her voice carried the careful tone she used when she believed Lenora was making a mistake, too large to correct. "A lighthouse," she said, not as a question, but as a verdict. "You bought a lighthouse. With what money, Nora? With what plan? Do you know what it costs to maintain a structure like that? Do you know what the insurance alone would be?" The questions came in a steady stream, each one reasonable, each one landing like a small stone, dropped onto something already cracked. Lenora listened, offered no defense, and ended the call with a quiet good night that satisfied neither of them. At work the next morning, the news had already spread, carried by the efficient machinery of small-town conversation. Diane, who worked the morning shift alongside her at the school cafeteria, brought it up before the first tray was loaded. She had heard from her cousin, who had heard from someone at the courthouse, that Lenora had bought the old lighthouse on Cray Point. Her tone was not cruel, but it was not kind either. It carried the particular weight of concern that is really judgment dressed in softer clothes. $50, Diane said, shaking her head as she stacked cups. "You know why it was $50, right? Because nobody else would take it for free." Lenora nodded and continued filling trays, her hands moving with the automatic rhythm of someone who had learned not to respond to every wound. The children reacted differently. Celia, old enough to understand the implications, but young enough to be excited anyway, asked questions that came from a place of genuine wonder. "Does it still have a light? Can we go inside? Is it on the ocean?" Martin, quieter and more cautious, watched his mother's face for cues, his eyes searching for the signal that would tell him whether this was good news or the other kind. Lenora answered what she could and deferred what she could not, promising a visit soon when the weather cleared and she had a free day. The promise felt fragile even as she made it. The landlord, Birch, found out within the week. He appeared at her door on a Tuesday evening, his knock carrying the weight of a man who believed his tenants owed him not just rent, but deference. He did not mention the lighthouse directly, but his words circled it. "I hear you've been spending money," he said, leaning against the doorframe with the posture of someone who had practiced looking casual. "You know your rent is past due. You know I've been patient." The implication was clear. Money spent on a lighthouse was money not spent on him. Lenora met his eyes and said nothing, and the silence between them held until he straightened and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. In the days that followed, the lighthouse occupied a space in her mind that grew steadily, like a room slowly filling with light. She pulled up the survey map at night after the children were asleep, tracing the outline of the property with her finger, memorizing the contours of the bluff, the position of the tower relative to the water, the boundaries that now belonged to her. The map showed details the auction photograph had not. A secondary structure labeled Keeper's Quarters, partially collapsed, a path leading down to a rocky shore, a notation near the base of the tower that read, "Sealed access. Lower chamber, with no further explanation." She stared at those words longer than the others, not because she understood their significance, but because they carried the particular weight of things intentionally left unspoken. 2 weeks after the auction, on a Saturday morning when the fog had lifted just enough to show the road ahead, she drove to the lighthouse. The children sat in the back seat, Celia pressed against the window, Martin clutching a book he was not reading. The road narrowed as it left town, the same pattern she had noticed years before. Pavement giving way to gravel, gravel giving way to dirt, dirt giving way to nothing more than a pair of tire tracks pressed into the earth by someone who had come this way long ago and never returned. The truck bounced and groaned over the uneven surface, and Lenora gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. When the lighthouse appeared, it was not the ruin she had prepared herself for. It was worse and better than she had imagined, both at once. The tower stood taller than the photographs had suggested, its stone walls darkened by decades of salt spray and neglect, its upper windows shattered and open to the sky like empty eye sockets. The keeper's quarters beside it slumped under the weight of a roof that had given up in sections, leaving portions of the interior exposed to weather. The fence she had seen in the auction photograph was gone entirely, reduced to a few posts leaning at angles that suggested exhaustion rather than collapse. The brush had overtaken everything below waist height, thick and tangled, with thorns that caught at her jeans as she stepped out of the truck. But the tower itself stood. That was what struck her first, and stayed with her longest. Despite the broken windows, the stained stone, the decades of abandonment, the structure had not fallen. It rose from the bluff with a stubbornness that felt almost personal, as if it had decided long ago that standing was the only thing left. It could do, and it would continue doing it until someone told it otherwise. The children stood beside her in silence, their faces turned upward, their expressions caught between wonder and uncertainty. Celia reached for her mother's hand. Martin moved closer, pressing his shoulder against her hip. They stood there together, the three of them, looking up at the lighthouse, while the wind moved through the brush and the sea murmured far below. Inside, the tower smelled of salt and stone and time. The door had resisted her key at first, the lock stiff with years of corrosion, but it yielded eventually with a sound like a held breath released. The ground floor was a single circular room, its walls curving inward, its floor covered with debris, fallen plaster, fragments of glass, leaves that had blown through the broken windows and settled into drifts against the walls. A spiral staircase rose from the center of the room, its iron steps rusted but intact, climbing upward into the dim light that filtered down from the lantern room above. She tested the first step with her weight, pressing carefully, listening for the groan of metal under stress. It held. The second step held as well, and the third. She told the children to wait below and climbed alone, each step bringing her higher into the tower, the air growing cooler and the light growing brighter as she ascended. From the lantern room, she could see everything. The coast stretched in both directions, rocky and wild, the water below churning against the base of the bluff with a rhythm that felt older than anything she had ever known. The land behind her rolled away in pale greens and browns, fields and forest, and the distant suggestion of the town she had left that morning. The glass that had once housed the lighthouse beam was gone, and the wind moved freely through the open space, carrying the smell of the sea directly to her face. She stood there for a long time, her hands resting on the railing, her eyes taking in a view that no amount of money could have purchased, and that $50 had somehow delivered to her. When she descended, the children were waiting exactly where she had left them, Celia sitting on a piece of fallen stone, Martin standing with his back against the wall, his eyes tracking the dust that drifted in the light. She told them the view was beautiful. She told them the stairs were strong. She told them this was theirs now, all of it, on the tower and the land and the sky above. Martin looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, and Celia smiled in a way that made Lenora's throat tighten. It was the smile of a child who wanted to believe, but had learned to wait for proof. Over the following weeks, Lenora returned to the lighthouse whenever her schedule allowed, which was rarely and never for long enough. She brought tools she borrowed from the hardware store downstairs, carried them up the narrow apartment staircase, and loaded them into the truck before dawn. She worked alone, clearing debris from the ground floor, testing walls for stability, mapping the layout of the structure with a notebook and a measuring tape she had found in the junk drawer at home. The work was slow, physical, and consuming in a way that left her hands raw and her mind quiet. And she welcomed both. The keeper's quarters, she discovered, were beyond saving. The roof had collapsed in 3 places, and water damage had rotted the floor joists beyond repair. She closed the door to that building and did not open it again, accepting the loss with the practiced detachment of someone who had learned to distinguish between things that could be saved and things that could not. The tower, however, was different. Its walls were thick, built from stone that had been quarried and fitted with a precision that modern construction rarely matched. The mortar had crumbled in places, and the ironwork showed the deep orange of advanced rust, but the bones of the structure were sound. She knew this the way she knew that bread dough was ready, not through measurement, but through touch, and through the feel of something that had been made to last. It was during one of these early visits, on a gray afternoon, when the fog pressed close and the sea was invisible below the bluff, that she first noticed the floor. She had been sweeping the ground level, pushing debris toward the door in slow, methodical arcs when the broom caught on something. A ridge in the stone, barely raised, running in a straight line across the floor where no line should have been. She paused and knelt, brushing away dust and fragments with her hand. The ridge continued, turning at a right angle, then turning again, forming the outline of a rectangle approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, set into the floor as though it had always been there, waiting beneath the accumulation of years. She sat back on her heels and studied it. The stone within the rectangle was the same as the stone around it, the same color, the same texture, the same age. But the seams were too clean, too deliberate. They did not follow the natural joints of the masonry. They had been cut. She ran her fingers along the edge, feeling the gap where the fitted stone met the surrounding floor. It was narrow, barely wide enough to accept the blade of a knife, but it was consistent, maintained around the entire perimeter. Someone had created this opening, and someone had sealed it, and both actions had been performed with a care that suggested importance. She told no one, not because she suspected what lay below, but because she didn't yet trust the discovery enough to share it. Discoveries, she had learned, were fragile things. They could be diminished by the wrong reaction, or reduced to nothing by someone else's skepticism or disinterest. She wanted to understand it first, to hold it in her own mind long enough to know whether it deserved attention or dismissal. The next time she visited, she brought a thin pry bar and a chisel borrowed from the hardware store owner, a quiet man named Ellis, who asked no questions when she returned tools with stone dust on the handles. She worked carefully, inserting the chisel into the seam and tapping it gently with the handle of the pry bar. The stone resisted at first, then shifted almost imperceptibly, a movement so slight she might have imagined it. She adjusted her angle and tried again. This time, the stone moved more clearly, rising a fraction of an inch along one edge. The air that escaped from beneath was cold, not the cold of earth or open water, but the sealed, the preserved cold of a space that had been closed for a very long time. It carried a smell she could not immediately identify, something between metal and dust, dry and faintly sharp, the scent of things that had been kept still and untouched in darkness. She pulled back and waited, letting the air settle, letting her breathing slow. The fog outside pressed against the tower walls, and the sea continued its rhythm far below, indifferent to what was happening inside. She did not lift the stone further that day. Instead, she replaced the chisel and pry bar in her bag, swept the debris back over the seam, and stood for a long moment in the center of the circular room, looking down at the floor beneath her feet. The rectangle was invisible again, hidden by dust and the ordinary appearance of old stone. No one entering the room would have noticed it. No one had, apparently, for decades. She locked the tower door behind her and drove home in silence, the key heavy in her pocket, the weight of what she had begun to uncover pressing against her thoughts with an insistence that made the familiar road feel different, as though she were traveling not just between places, but between versions of her life, one in which the lighthouse was merely a building, and another in which it was something else entirely. That evening, after the children were asleep and the apartment settled into its nightly quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with the survey map spread before her. Her eyes returned again and again to the notation she had noticed weeks before. Sealed access, lower chamber. The words had seemed administrative then, a footnote on a document filled with footnotes. Now they felt like a message left by someone who had known exactly what they were describing and had chosen to say as little as possible. She traced the outline of the tower on the map, measuring distances, comparing the position of the sealed notation to the rectangle she had found in the floor. They aligned. Not approximately, not close enough to suggest coincidence, but precisely, as if the person who had drawn the map and the person who had sealed the stone had been working from the same blueprint. The realization settled into her chest with a pressure that was not quite excitement and not quite fear, but something between the two, a feeling that the ground beneath her feet, both literally and figuratively, was less solid than she had assumed. No, she folded the map carefully and placed it back in the manila envelope. Then she sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the street below, and allowed herself to consider the possibility that the lighthouse she had bought for $50, the lighthouse no one else had wanted, the lighthouse that had been called worthless by everyone who knew it existed, was hiding something that its silence had been designed to protect. Outside, the night moved on. The town slept. The apartment building creaked with the small adjustments of old wood and settling foundations. And somewhere along the coast, the lighthouse stood in the dark, its tower rising above the bluff, its door locked, its floor concealing a chamber that had waited in sealed silence for longer than anyone alive could remember. It did not know that someone had finally noticed. It did not know that the hands that had touched its hidden seam belonged to a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything left to find. But if stone could hold intention, if walls could carry the memory of purpose, then the lighthouse knew what it had always known, that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, press upward over time, and that the person who finally listens is rarely the one anyone expected. The week that followed the discovery of the sealed rectangle moved with a slowness that felt almost deliberate, as if time itself had thickened around the knowledge Lenora now carried. She went through her days, cafeteria, laundromat, and apartment, performing each task with the same attention she always gave. But beneath the surface, her mind returned constantly to the lighthouse, to the cold air that had risen from the seam, to the notation on the map that now felt less like a footnote and more like a warning. She told no one. Not Diane, who would have asked too many questions wrapped in concern. Not her mother, who would have turned the discovery into another reason to worry. Not even Celia, whose curiosity would have been immediate and insistent and difficult to manage. The secret sat inside her like a second heartbeat, steady and private, and she protected it with the same quiet fierceness she brought to everything that mattered. At night, after the children slept, she researched. The library's public computers were slow and limited, but they were free. Oh, and Lenora had long ago learned to extract value from things others overlooked. She searched for the history of the lighthouse, starting with its construction and working forward through decades of records that grew thinner as the years progressed. What she found was fragmentary, but suggestive. The lighthouse had been built in 1887, commissioned by the federal government as part of a chain of coastal lights designed to guide shipping traffic through a stretch of water known for its currents and fog. The original keeper had been a man named Amos Hartwell, whose family had maintained the light for 3 generations. The Hartwells were mentioned in county records, church registries, and the occasional newspaper article, but always briefly, as if their presence was acknowledged without being examined. The lighthouse had been decommissioned in 1971, its function replaced by automated systems and satellite navigation. The property had passed to the last surviving Hartwell, a woman named Edith, who had lived in the keeper's quarters alone until her death in 1986. After that, the property had entered county possession, and the records grew sparse. Maintenance reports noted the deterioration of the keeper's quarters and recommended demolition. Structural assessments of the tower were brief and inconclusive, noting stability without enthusiasm. The phrase sealed access, lower chamber appeared in a single inspection report from 1993, attributed to an engineer who had noted it without further investigation. The report recommended no action. Lenora read that phrase again, seated in the hard plastic chair of the library computer station, the screen's blue light reflecting off her face. No action. 2 words that had allowed the chamber beneath the lighthouse to remain undisturbed for another 30 years. She wondered about the engineer who had written them, whether he had been incurious, overworked, or simply following the unspoken rule that governs so many encounters with the unknown. If it is not causing a visible problem, leave it alone. She wondered too about Edith Hartwell, a woman who had lived alone in the keeper's quarters for 15 years after the lighthouse went dark. What had those years contained? What had she known about the building she inhabited, about the floor beneath the tower, about the chamber that someone, perhaps one of the Hartwells themselves, had taken such care to seal? The records offered no answers, so Edith appeared in them only as a name attached to dates, birth, residence, death, the outlines of a life without its content. The following Saturday, Lenora drove to the lighthouse again. She brought the pry bar and chisel, along with a flashlight, a length of rope, and a first aid kit she had assembled from supplies at the dollar store. She also brought a bottle of water and 2 granola bars, not because she expected to be gone long, but because preparation was her way of managing fear. If she could plan for contingencies, she could convince herself that she was in control, even when control was exactly what she lacked. The fog was lighter that morning, thin enough to let sunlight through in pale, shifting beams that moved across the surface of the water, like searchlights operated by an unsteady hand. The tower stood as it always had, unsolid and patient, its stone walls absorbing the light without reflecting it. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar smell of salt and dust rising to meet her. She swept the floor clean this time, carefully, deliberately, exposing the rectangle fully. In the clear light that entered through the broken windows above, the seams were more visible than before. Thin, dark lines against the pale stone, forming a shape that could not be mistaken for anything natural. She knelt beside it and placed both hands flat against the surface, feeling for the subtle difference in temperature that had startled her on her previous visit. It was still there, faint but unmistakable, a coolness that rose from below like breath from a sleeping body. She began to work. The chisel found the seam, and she tapped it with controlled, measured strikes, and feeling the stone shift incrementally with each blow. The process was slow, the stone heavy, the tools inadequate for the task. Sweat gathered at her temples and along her spine despite the cool air. Her shoulders burned, and her wrists ached. She paused frequently, sitting back on her heels, breathing, studying the progress she had made. The stone had risen perhaps half an inch along one edge, enough to confirm that it was not mortared in place, but resting in a fitted groove, held down by weight and precision rather than permanent adhesive. After nearly an hour of work, she managed to insert the pry bar beneath the edge and lever the stone upward. It moved with a reluctance that felt almost deliberate, as if it were deciding whether to allow what was about to happen. She braced the bar and pushed, her legs trembling with the effort, and the stone rose further, revealing a dark gap beneath it that widened as the slab tilted upward and finally came to rest at an angle against the wall. The opening was rectangular, as she had expected, but deeper than she had imagined. A set of stone steps descended into darkness, each one narrow and worn smooth by use that must have been frequent at some point in the building's history. The air that rose from below was cold and still, carrying the same metallic, dusty scent she had noticed before, but stronger now, more present, as if the chamber below had been holding its breath and had finally exhaled. She did not descend immediately. She sat at the edge of the opening, her feet resting on the first step, her flashlight beam cutting downward into a darkness that seemed to resist illumination. The beam caught stone walls, close together, slick with moisture in some places, dry and pale in others. She counted the steps as far as the light would reach. 7, 8, 9. Then the staircase turned, and the light showed only the curve of a wall disappearing to the left. Her phone had no signal inside the tower. She had known that before arriving, but knowing it and feeling it were different things. The absence of connection pressed against her awareness with a weight that made the silence around her feel deeper, more complete. She was alone, truly alone, in a way that the apartment and the laundromat and the cafeteria never allowed. The realization was both frightening and clarifying. No one knew she was here. No one could reach her. Whatever lay at the bottom of those steps, she would face it without witness or assistance. She turned off the flashlight and sat in the dark for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting the sound of the sea fill the tower through the broken windows above. The waves were steady, unhurried, and their rhythm steadied her in a way that human reassurance could not. She turned the light back on, gripped the rope she had tied to the base of the spiral staircase, and began to descend. The steps were narrow, each one requiring her to place her feet carefully, angling sideways where the stone had worn to a slope. The walls on either side were close enough to touch, and she braced herself against them as she moved, feeling the cold stone press against her palms. The air grew colder with each step, denser, carrying a stillness that felt physical, as if the space below existed in a different relationship with time than the world above. And she counted as she went. 10 steps. 12. The staircase turned to the left, as she had seen from above, and continued downward at a steeper angle. The flashlight beam swung with her movements, casting shadows that shifted and stretched against the walls. She noticed marks on the stone, not scratches or natural wear, but deliberate grooves, shallow and evenly spaced, as though someone had used the walls to measure or record something she could not yet understand. At the 15th step, the staircase ended. The floor beneath her feet was flat, solid, the stone different from the steps, smoother, darker, laid with a precision that suggested purpose. The space opened around her, wider than the staircase had implied, and her flashlight revealed the outlines of a room that should not have existed beneath a lighthouse built in 1887. The ceiling was low, perhaps 7 feet, supported by arched stone ribs that ran from wall to wall like the bones of something buried and forgotten. The air here was perfectly still, sealed, untouched. Her light moved across the walls, across the floor, and then it caught on something that made her stop breathing entirely. She did not move. The flashlight trembled in her hand, casting a small, unsteady circle of light on the shape before her. For several seconds, the world above, The children, the apartment, the laundromat, the rent notices, all of it, ceased to exist. There was only the chamber, the silence, and the thing her light had found. Against the far wall, stacked with the kind of order that only deliberate hands could produce, were wooden crates. Not one or two, but rows of them, arranged in tiers that climbed from the floor to within inches of the arched ceiling. They were dark with age, their surfaces marked by stenciled letters and numbers she could not read from where she stood. Brass fittings held their lids in place, green with oxidation, but intact. Between the crates, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord, were smaller bundles, dozens of them, packed tightly together, like the belongings of someone who had intended to return and never had. She moved the flashlight slowly, tracing the perimeter of the chamber. The crates continued along the adjacent wall, stacked with the same precision, their arrangement suggesting not haste, but planning. Whoever had placed them here had done so over time, with forethought, with the expectation that they would remain undisturbed for a very long period. The oilcloth wrappings showed no signs of water damage, no mold, no deterioration beyond the natural aging of materials kept in stable conditions. The sealed chamber had done its job. It had preserved what it held, with an efficiency that rivaled any modern vault. Lenora approached the nearest crate and placed her hand against its side. The wood was cold, dense, heavier than modern lumber. She could feel the grain beneath her fingers, the slight roughness of age, the smooth spots where the stenciled markings had been applied. She angled her flashlight toward the lettering and read what she could. The words were faded, but legible. A shipping designation, a port of origin she did not recognize, and a date. 1923. She moved to the next crate. 1921. The next. 1919. The dates descended as she moved along the wall, stretching backward through time as if she were reading a calendar in reverse. Her hands were shaking. She knew this not because she could feel the tremor, but because the flashlight beam danced against the wall, refusing to hold still, despite her effort to control it. She set the flashlight down on a flat section of stone and pressed both palms against her thighs, breathing slowly, forcing the muscles in her shoulders to release. The chamber waited around her, patient, offering no comfort and no urgency, simply existing as it had existed for a century, a sealed room beneath a lighthouse at the edge of the world, filled with things that someone had once valued enough to hide. She untied the cord on one of the smaller bundles, her fingers working carefully despite their trembling. The oilcloth fell open, revealing a layer of linen beneath, and within the linen, a shape that caught the flashlight and threw it back in a way that made her breath stop. Gold. Not the dull suggestion of gold, not the yellow of paint or plating, but the unmistakable weight and warmth of solid gold, shaped into a bar roughly the size of a book, its surface smooth except for a stamped insignia she did not recognize. She lifted it instinctively, and the weight surprised her. Dense, real, undeniable, pulling downward with a gravity that felt out of proportion to its size. She set it down carefully and opened another bundle. More gold, this time in the form of coins, dozens of them, stacked and wrapped in cloth that had yellowed but held. The coins were old, their edges sharp, their faces stamped with images she could not identify in the flashlight's unsteady glow. She picked one up and turned it in her fingers, feeling the ridged edge, the raised relief of a figure she did not know, the numbers along the rim that placed its origin somewhere in the early 20th century. It was heavier than any coin she had ever held, heavier than the quarters she counted at the laundromat, heavier than the $50 she had paid for the building that now surrounded her. She opened a third bundle. This one held something different, a wooden case, its lid secured with a brass latch that clicked open under light pressure. Inside, Resting on a bed of aged velvet were gemstones. She did not know their names. She did not need to. They caught the flashlight and multiplied it, scattering points of color across the low ceiling of the chamber. Blue, white, deep red, green, so vivid it looked alive. Each stone was set in its own compartment within the case, held in place by the velvet's gentle grip, arranged by size, or perhaps by value, a system she could sense but not decode. Lenora closed the case and sat on the stone floor. She set the flashlight beside her and folded her hands in her lap, staring at the rows of crates and bundles that stretched away from her in the darkness. The scale of it was beyond anything she had prepared herself to encounter. This was not a forgotten stash, not a single treasure buried by a recluse or a smuggler. This was a collection, systematic, organized, accumulated over years, perhaps decades, and sealed with the kind of care that spoke of intention far greater than any one person's hoarding instinct. Her mind tried to build explanations. The Hartwells, 3 generations of lighthouse keepers living at the edge of the coast, watching ships pass in the fog, maintaining a light that guided vessels through dangerous waters. What else had they maintained? What else had passed through their hands, brought by sea, and stored beneath stone, hidden from the world by the very isolation that made the lighthouse both essential and forgettable? She thought of Edith Hartwell, the last keeper, alone in the quarters for 15 years after the light went dark. Had she known? Had she descended these steps, walked among these crates, touched this gold? Had she lived above it all those years, a woman alone on a bluff, guarding a fortune she could never spend, because spending it would reveal its existence, and revealing its existence would end the only life she had known? The questions multiplied faster than Lenora could contain them. She pressed her palms against the stone floor, feeling its solidity, anchoring herself in the physical reality of where she sat. The gold was real. The coins were real. The gemstones were real. Whatever their origin, whatever story connected them to this place, they existed now beneath her lighthouse, in a chamber that the county had sealed and forgotten, on a property she had purchased for the price of a meal. She did not know how long she sat there. Time in the chamber moved differently, stripped of the cues, sunlight, shadow, sound that normally marked its passing. When she finally stood, her legs ached, and the cold had settled into her joints with a persistence that made her movements stiff and careful. She repacked the bundle she had opened, tying the oilcloth with the same knots she had found, returning each piece to its position in the arrangement. She did not take anything with her. The thought crossed her mind, a single gold coin, small enough to fit in her pocket, valuable enough to change the shape of her next month, but she left it where it lay. Some instinct deeper than need told her that removing anything before she understood what she was dealing with would be a mistake she could not undo. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step returning her to the world above. When she emerged into the ground floor of the tower, the light through the broken windows felt impossibly bright, the air warm by comparison, the sound of the sea a sudden presence after the absolute silence of the chamber below. She replaced the stone slab, working it back into its groove with effort that left her arms trembling. She swept dust and debris over the seams until the floor looked undisturbed. Then she locked the tower, walked to her truck, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The steering wheel was warm beneath her hands. The sun had moved across the sky while she had been below, and the afternoon light lay golden across the bluff, turning the tower's shadow long and thin against the overgrown ground. She looked at the lighthouse in the rearview mirror as she finally turned the key, watching it shrink as the truck bounced along the dirt track, growing smaller but no less significant, a structure that had changed its meaning entirely in the span of a single morning. On the drive home, the world felt rearranged. Not in any visible way. The road was the same road. The town approached with the same familiar landmarks. The apartment waited with the same leaking faucet and thin walls. But Lenora moved through it differently now, carrying knowledge that separated her from everything and everyone around her. She parked the truck and climbed the stairs to the apartment. Celia was reading on the couch. Martin was building something with blocks on the floor. They looked up when she entered, and the ordinariness of their faces, the perfect dailiness of their presence, struck her with a force that made her turn away so they would not see the tears that had come without warning. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building settling and the distant rhythm of traffic, and she thought about what to do. The fortune beneath the lighthouse was not hers to claim simply because she owned the building above it. She understood this instinctively, even without legal knowledge. There would be questions of ownership, of origin, of taxes, of history. There would be people who would want to take it from her, people with authority and expertise, and the particular confidence that comes from knowing how the world is supposed to work. She was a woman who folded laundry and served cafeteria breakfast and could not pay her rent on time. The distance between her life and the reality of what she had found felt immeasurable, a gap she could see but could not bridge without help. The word help turned in her mind like a key she did not yet know how to use. She needed someone who understood things she did not: property law or appraisal, the protocols that governed discoveries of this kind. She needed someone she could trust, which was a harder requirement than the first, because trust had been unreliable in her experience, a bridge that held weight until the moment it didn't. She thought of Ellis, the hardware store owner. He was a quiet man, methodical, the kind of person who answered questions precisely and never volunteered more than what was asked. He had rented her tools without curiosity, accepted their return without inspection, and treated her with the unremarkable respect that she valued more than kindness. She did not know if he could help, but she trusted that he would not spread what she told him through the town like seeds in a strong wind. She found him the next morning behind the counter, sorting screws into labeled bins with the patience of someone who found order satisfying. The store was empty, the hour early, the light through the front window thin and still. She approached the counter and stood there for a moment before speaking, aware that what she was about to say would change the shape of their relationship and possibly the trajectory of her life. Ellis looked up, acknowledged her with a nod, and waited. He was, she realized, a man who understood the value of letting someone arrive at their own words. She told him. Not everything, not the gold or the gemstones or the scale of what lay beneath the lighthouse floor. She told him she had found something in the lighthouse, something old, something sealed, something she did not fully understand. She told him she needed advice, and that she needed it from someone who would not treat her discovery as gossip or opportunity. Ellis listened without interrupting, his hand still resting on the counter, his expression shifting only slightly as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said a single name. Margaret Calloway. She's a lawyer in Bridgehaven, handles property and estate work. Honest. Careful. She'll know what to do. The drive to Bridgehaven took 40 minutes. Lenora made an appointment by phone, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, and arrived at the office early, sitting in the waiting room with a composure she did not feel. Margaret Calloway was a woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed and unhurried, who listened to Lenora's account with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades separating signal from noise. Lenora told her about the auction, the lighthouse, the sealed chamber, the crates, the gold, the coins, the gemstones. She told her about the Hartwells, the decommissioned light, the county's years of neglect. She did not exaggerate, and she did not minimize. She laid out the facts as she knew them and waited. Margaret asked questions, precise, probing, but never unkind. She asked about the deed, the disclosure documents, the survey map. She asked whether Lenora had removed anything from the chamber. She asked whether anyone else knew. Lenora answered honestly, and with each answer, she felt the situation move further from private discovery into something larger, more structured, more real. Margaret took notes in a leather journal, her handwriting small and neat, and when Lenora finished, she closed the journal and looked at her with an expression that contained equal measures of professional caution and personal amazement. "You need an appraiser," Margaret said. "Before anything else, someone independent, someone bonded, someone who can document what's there without a stake in the outcome. I know who to call. But I want you to understand something first. Once we bring someone in, this stops being your secret. It becomes a process. There will be assessments, legal filings, potential claims. The county may argue interest. The state may get involved. If the items have historical significance, federal agencies might step in. You'll need to be prepared for all of that." Lenora listened and nodded. She had expected this. She had not expected the particular heaviness of hearing it confirmed aloud, the feeling of something precious and private being drawn out of her hands and into a system she could not control. But she also understood that keeping the discovery hidden was not a real option. Secrets of that scale did not stay buried. They surfaced eventually, and when they did, the person who had tried to contain them always paid a higher price than the person who had let them go. The appraiser arrived at the lighthouse 10 days later. His name was Gordon Pierce, a man who had spent 30 years evaluating estates, collections, and recovered assets for insurance companies and government agencies. He was calm, thorough, and equipped with tools and protocols that turned Lenora's flashlight exploration into something resembling a controlled excavation. Now Margaret accompanied him, along with a photographer and a notary, whose presence made the proceedings feel official in a way that both reassured and unsettled Lenora. They descended together, the stairs groaning faintly under the additional weight. Gordon moved through the chamber with the practiced ease of someone who had spent his career in rooms that others found overwhelming. He examined the crates one by one, lifting lids with gloved hands, recording contents with a digital inventory system that beeped softly each time an entry was completed. The photographer documented everything: the placement of crates, the condition of wrappings, the inscriptions on wood and metal, the chamber itself with its arched ceiling and sealed stone walls. The process took 3 full days. Lenora was present for all of it, standing at the edge of the chamber or sitting on the stairs, watching as the contents of the crates emerged into the light for the first time in a century. What she had seen on her first visit, the gold bars, the coins, the gemstones, was only a fraction of what the chamber held. There were more crates, their contents varied and meticulously packed. Silver ingots wrapped in waxed paper, jewelry, rings, necklaces, brooches, each piece stored individually in cases lined with velvet or silk. Rare coins from multiple countries and multiple centuries, sorted by origin and preserved in conditions that had maintained their surfaces with remarkable fidelity. There were documents as well, shipping manifests, bills of lading, a correspondence on paper so old that Gordon handled it with tweezers and placed it in archival sleeves before reading it aloud. The story that emerged from those documents was both simpler and more extraordinary than Lenora had imagined. The Hartwell family, beginning with Amos in the late 1880s, had used their position at the lighthouse to conduct a quiet but extensive salvage operation. Ships that foundered on the rocky coast, cargoes lost to the sea or abandoned by insurers, goods that washed ashore or lay in shallow water, close enough to be recovered by a determined man with a boat and a knowledge of tides. All of it had been collected, cataloged, and stored beneath the lighthouse floor. The operation had continued for nearly 50 years, passed from father to son, refined with each generation, protected by the very isolation that made the lighthouse's existence necessary. The scale of the accumulation was staggering. Gordon's initial assessment, delivered to Lenora and Margaret in the tower's ground floor on the afternoon of the third day, was measured and precise, but his voice carried an undercurrent of something close to disbelief. He had cataloged over 1,100 individual items, ranging from single coins to crates containing dozens of gold bars. The precious metals alone, gold and silver, represented a significant store of wealth. The gemstones, many of which appeared to be of exceptional quality, added another layer of value. The rare coins, some of which Gordon identified as among the most sought after by collectors worldwide, represented a category of value that operated by its own rules, where rarity and provenance could multiply worth far beyond the metal content. He paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked at Lenora directly. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've appraised estates worth millions. I've handled recovery operations that made national news. What is in that chamber is unlike anything I have encountered in my career. The total value, and I want to emphasize that this is a preliminary estimate, subject to individual authentication of each piece, is in the range of $312 million. The number landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Lenora heard it, processed it, and felt nothing. Not joy, not relief, not triumph. Nothing. The number was too large to attach itself to her reality. It existed in a space that her life had never prepared her to enter, a space where money stopped being the thing you counted at the end of the week and became something else entirely. A force, a weight, a new kind of weather. She looked at Margaret, who met her eyes with the calm steadiness of someone who understood that the next few moments would determine how the rest of this story unfolded. $312 million, Lenora repeated, and the words sounded foreign in her mouth, like a phrase from a language she had heard, but never spoken. She looked down at her hands, still rough from the pry bar, still marked by the calluses of mop handles and laundry carts, and she tried to connect those hands to the number that had just been spoken in this room. The connection would not form. It hovered somewhere outside her comprehension, waiting, like the lighthouse itself had waited, for her to find a way to accept it. That evening, she sat in her truck outside the apartment building and did not go in. The windows of the apartment glowed with the warm light of the lamps she had bought at the thrift store, and she could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Celia, probably reading. Martin, probably playing. They did not know. They were inside the life she had built for them, the life made of cafeteria trays and laundromat quarters and granola bars in her bag, and she was sitting outside it with a number in her head that could tear down every wall and build new ones in their place. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and breathed. The truck smelled of dust and salt, saw traces of the lighthouse she carried with her, now everywhere she went. She thought about the bills on the counter, the rent she owed Birch, the shoes Martin needed, the inhaler refill she had been putting off because the copay was $12 she did not have. $12. The thought of $12 existing in the same reality as $312 million felt like a joke, told by someone who did not understand humor. When she finally went inside, the children were in their pajamas, teeth brushed, ready for bed. Martin held up a drawing he had made, the lighthouse, recognizable by its tall, narrow shape, and the circle at the top that represented the light. He had drawn it surrounded by stars, with 3 small figures standing at the base. "Mom, Celia, and me," he said, pointing to each one. Lenora took the drawing and held it carefully, as if it were made of something more fragile than paper. She tucked them both into bed, kissed their foreheads, and stood in the doorway of their room for a long time after they fell asleep, watching their breathing, thinking about what was coming and how to protect them from the parts of it that would not be gentle. The news did not break immediately. Margaret handled the legal filings with the same precision she had brought to their first meeting, coordinating with the county, the state, and the relevant federal agencies to establish Lenora's claim while satisfying the requirements that governed discoveries of this kind. There were hearings, letters, consultations with historians and maritime law experts whose opinions were solicited and weighed. The process was slow and procedural, and Lenora endured it with a patience that surprised even herself, answering questions, providing documents, appearing where she was asked to appear, and returning to her apartment each evening to cook dinner and help with homework, as though the world had not shifted on its axis. But the world had shifted, and the evidence of it began to appear in ways she could not control. A reporter from the regional paper called Margaret's office, asking about an unusual property filing associated with the Cray Point Lighthouse. Margaret declined comment, but the question itself was a signal. Information had begun to move, carried by the same currents of small-town conversation that had spread the news of Lenora's auction purchase weeks before. People who had once dismissed the lighthouse now spoke about it differently, their voices carrying the particular edge of those who suspect they have missed something important. Diane was among the first to hear. She approached Lenora at the cafeteria with a directness that lacked her usual softening. "I heard something about the lighthouse," she said, her voice low enough to suggest she considered the information dangerous. "Something about an appraisal. Something about the county getting involved." Lenora looked at her and saw not concern, but calculation, the rapid mental adjustment of someone realizing that the person they had pitied might no longer require their pity. She told Diane only what was public, that an assessment was underway, that the process was being handled legally, and offered nothing more. Diane nodded, her expression unreadable, and returned to her station without another word. What her mother called that evening, her voice carrying a new frequency that Lenora recognized as fear disguised as authority. "What is happening with that lighthouse, Nora? I'm hearing things from people. People are talking about money, about treasure, about all kinds of nonsense. Is this true? Is any of this real?" Lenora sat in the kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and the stack of overdue rent notices still standing on the counter beside her. She told her mother the truth, that something had been found, that it was being evaluated, that she could not say more until the process was complete. The silence that followed was long, weighted with everything her mother wanted to say, and the awareness that saying it would not change anything. "Be careful," her mother finally said, and Lenora heard in those two words all the love and all the fear that had defined their relationship for as long as she could remember. Birch appeared at her door on a Wednesday evening, his posture different from his previous visits. The landlord, who had leaned against her doorframe with practiced condescension, now stood straighter, his eyes moving across her face with an interest that had not been there before. He told her he had heard rumors. He told her he wanted her to know that he had always been flexible with the rent, that he understood the difficulties of single parenthood, that he considered her a valued tenant. The words were the same words he had never spoken before, delivered with a warmth that felt manufactured and 3 years too late. Lenora listened, thanked him for his understanding, and closed the door. She did not tell him that the appraisal was nearly complete. She did not tell him that Margaret had already begun the process of establishing full legal claim. She did not tell him that the number attached to what lay beneath the lighthouse floor was larger than anything his 4 buildings on the same block could collectively represent. She simply closed the door and returned to the kitchen, where Martin's drawing of the lighthouse hung on the refrigerator, with a magnet shaped like a fish, the three small figures standing at the base of the tower, looking up at stars that a 7-year-old had drawn because he believed they belonged there. The formal authentication took 6 weeks. During that time, Gordon Pierce coordinated with a network of specialists, numismatists for the coins, gemologists for the stones, metallurgists for the gold and silver, historians for the documents and manifests. Each expert produced a report that added detail and certainty to the preliminary estimate. The coins included specimens that had not appeared at auction in decades, their provenance traceable through maritime records that matched the Hartwell salvage operations. The gemstones, once cleaned and examined, proved to be of a quality that placed several of them among the finest known examples of their type. The gold bars bore markings consistent with shipments lost during specific maritime disasters, documented in the historical record, their existence known, but their recovery never confirmed. The final number, when it arrived in a document bearing the signatures of 7 independent experts, was $312 million. Not a preliminary estimate, not a range, a figure, specific and authenticated, representing the combined value of the contents of a sealed chamber beneath a lighthouse that a woman named Lenora had purchased at a county auction for $50. Margaret delivered the news in her office in Bridgehaven, the leather journal open on her desk, the document placed between them like a bridge connecting 2 worlds. She spoke carefully, explaining what the number meant in practical terms, the taxes that would apply, the legal protections that were in place, the timeline for liquidation if Lenora chose to sell, the options for preservation if she chose to keep. She explained the charitable trust structures that could shield the children's inheritance, the financial advisory teams that would need to be assembled, and the security protocols that would become necessary once the discovery became public knowledge. Lenora listened to all of it, absorbing the words the way she had absorbed everything in her life, steadily, without drama, with the quiet attention of someone who had learned that understanding comes not from reaction, but from patience. When Margaret finished, Lenora asked a single question. "Can I keep the lighthouse?" Margaret looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. "Yes," she said. "You can keep the lighthouse." The news became public on a Tuesday, not because Lenora chose that day, but because the process had reached a point where disclosure was required, filings that entered the public record, notifications to agencies whose involvement triggered their own reporting obligations. Margaret had prepared her for this. It had walked her through the sequence of events that would follow, the inquiries, the attention, the sudden, disorienting shift from invisibility to exposure. But preparation and experience are different animals, and Lenora discovered this the moment her phone began to ring. The first call came from the regional newspaper, the second from a television station 2 counties over. The third from a number she did not recognize, a voice identifying itself as a producer for a national morning program, asking if Lenora would be available for an interview within the hour. She declined all of them, sitting on the edge of her bed in the apartment above the hardware store, her phone buzzing in her hand like something alive and increasingly difficult to hold. Through the thin wall, she could hear Celia asking Martin what was happening, and then Martin answering with the uncertain confidence of a 7-year-old who understood that something had changed, but not what. By midday, the story had reached the kind of velocity that small-town infrastructure could not contain. Cray Point Lighthouse was no longer a forgotten ruin at the end of a forgotten road. It was a headline, a breaking update, a trending phrase that moved through screens and conversations with the indiscriminate energy of things that are too extraordinary to be ignored. The numbers were repeated and amplified, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. 300 million became $500 million in some retellings, $1 billion in others, the truth inflating with each retelling as if the story itself could not resist the momentum of its own significance. In town, the reaction split along lines that Lenora had anticipated but couldn't have fully prepared for. There were those who expressed genuine happiness, the woman at the grocery store who squeezed her hand and said, "You deserve this," with tears in her eyes, the old man at the gas station who nodded slowly and told her that the Hartwells would have approved. These encounters moved her, not because she needed validation, but because they reminded her that kindness still existed in places she had stopped looking for it. Then there were the others, the ones whose reactions carried a different weight, a particular mixture of surprise and resentment that Lenora recognized as the sound of people recalculating her worth and finding themselves suddenly on the wrong side of the equation. Diane, who had told her that no one would take the lighthouse for free, now spoke about the discovery with a familiarity that implied she had always seen the potential. She told people at the cafeteria that she and Lenora were close friends, that she had encouraged the purchase, that she had known something special about that place from the start. The revision was so complete, so seamless, that Lenora might have admired it if she had not been the person whose real history was being rewritten. Her mother called 3 times in a single afternoon. The first call was shock. The second was a list of warnings about taxes, about people who would try to take advantage, about the danger of sudden wealth. The third was quieter, softer, and carried the words her mother had never been able to say easily. "I'm proud of you, Nora. I didn't understand. And I'm sorry." Lenora held the phone against her ear and let the silence that followed those words fill the small kitchen where she had sat so many nights, staring at a stack of overdue notices that would never grow again. Birch, the landlord, arrived the following morning. He did not knock. He rang the doorbell, a distinction Lenora noted with the precision of someone who had spent 3 years on the receiving end of his knuckles against her door. He was smiling, a wide, unfamiliar expression that sat awkwardly on a face she had only ever seen in states of impatience or displeasure. He told her he wanted to congratulate her personally. He told her he had always believed in her, that he had admired her resilience, that he had given her extra time on the rent. Not because he expected repayment, but because he respected what she was building. The performance was elaborate and entirely unconvincing, and Lenora watched it with an expression that gave away nothing. She thanked him, as she had thanked him before, and closed the door. The difference was that this time, the door closed on a version of their relationship that would never reopen. She did not owe him anger or satisfaction. She owed him nothing at all, and the freedom of that realization was worth more, in that moment, than any number Gordon Pierce could have placed on a document. The children learned the truth that evening. Lenora sat them at the kitchen table, the same table where she had reviewed the survey map, where she had stared at rent notices, where she had eaten meals assembled from whatever the week's budget allowed. And she told them what she had found beneath the lighthouse. She used simple words, on a clear and direct, because her children had spent their lives in a home where honesty was the only currency that never lost its value. Celia listened with wide eyes that moved from wonder to disbelief to something that looked like the beginning of understanding. Martin listened with his hands folded in his lap, his face serious, his questions few but precise. "How much money is it?" he asked, and Lenora told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that no adult had thought to ask. "Can we still go to the lighthouse?" Lenora pulled him into her arms and held him there, feeling the smallness of his body against hers, the warmth that had sustained her through years when warmth was the only thing she had in abundance. "Yes," she whispered against his hair. "We can still go to the lighthouse. It's ours." That night, and after the children slept, Lenora sat alone in the kitchen for the last time as the person she had been. She did not know this consciously. She did not mark the moment with ceremony or reflection. She simply sat, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that grew cold while she stared at the drawing on the refrigerator. The lighthouse, the stars, the three small figures standing together at the base. The drawing was the most valuable thing she owned. Not because of what it depicted, but because of who had made it, and why, and the world it represented. A world where a lighthouse was not a fortune, or a headline, or a legal proceeding, but a place where a family stood together and looked up. Outside, the town was quiet. The apartment building settled into its nightly sounds, the creaks and sighs of old wood finding its rest. When somewhere along the coast, the lighthouse stood in the dark, its tower solid against the stars, its chamber empty of secrets for the first time in a century. The sea moved against the bluff below, steady and unhurried, as it had moved for longer than anyone could measure. And in the space between the town and the coast, between the life she had lived and the life that was coming, Lenora sat and breathed and let the silence hold her, knowing that tomorrow the world would ask things of her. She had never been asked before, and trusting, quietly and stubbornly, that she would find a way to answer. The weeks that followed moved with a speed that Lenora had never experienced. Time, which had always felt heavy and slow in her life, suddenly compressed, each day carrying more weight than any single day had a right to hold. On decisions that would have once taken months now arrived in hours, stacked on top of one another like the crates in the chamber she had uncovered, each one requiring attention, precision, and a steadiness she was still learning to trust in herself. Margaret assembled a team, financial advisors, estate planners, a tax attorney, whose hourly rate would have once represented a full week of Lenora's combined income. They met in conference rooms with long tables and water pitchers that were refilled by people whose names she did not learn, and they spoke in language that moved between the technical and the reassuring, explaining structures and timelines and obligations that felt less like decisions and more like architecture, something being built around her, room by room, designed to hold the weight of what she now possessed. She listened to all of it. She asked questions when she did not understand, and she did not pretend to understand when she did not. This was a skill she had developed over years of being underestimated. The willingness to say, "I don't know," without shame, to sit in the discomfort of ignorance long enough for clarity to arrive. The advisors, who were accustomed to clients who performed confidence regardless of whether they possessed it, seemed surprised by her directness. One of them, a woman named Sandra, who managed trusts for families with generational wealth, told her privately after a meeting that she had never worked with someone who approached a fortune with as much discipline as Lenora brought to it. Lenora thanked her and said nothing else, because the truth was simpler than Sandra imagined. Discipline was not something she had cultivated for this moment. It was something poverty had taught her, and she saw no reason to abandon the lesson just because the circumstances had changed. The first thing she did with the money was pay the rent. Not because Birch deserved promptness after years of indifference, but because the debt existed, and debts that existed deserved to be honored regardless of the person they were owed to. She wrote the check for the full outstanding balance, placed it in an envelope, and slid it beneath his office door on a Thursday morning before he arrived. She did not include a note. The amount spoke for itself, and silence, she had learned, often said more than words. Birch cashed the check the same day. He did not call to acknowledge it. She had not expected him to. The second thing she did was refill Martin's inhaler prescription. She drove to the pharmacy, handed over the insurance card that had always required a copay she could barely afford, and paid the $12 without the familiar tightening in her chest that had accompanied every medical expense for as long as she could remember. The pharmacist, a young woman who had processed Lenora's prescriptions for years and who had seen her count change on the counter more than once, looked at her with an expression that held something unspoken. Lenora met her eyes and smiled, and the pharmacist smiled back, and nothing more needed to be said. She bought Martin new shoes. She drove to the store on a Wednesday afternoon, a day she would normally have been folding clothes at the laundromat, and she let him try on every pair that caught his eye. He moved through the aisles with the careful excitement of a child who had learned to want quietly, picking up shoes and setting them down, looking at her for permission before reaching for the next. She told him to choose whatever he wanted. The words felt strange in her mouth, unfamiliar as a foreign phrase she had learned, but never spoken aloud. He chose a pair of blue sneakers, bright and clean, and he wore them out of the store, carrying his old shoes in the bag, looking down at his feet every few steps, as if to confirm that the new ones were real. She bought Celia the set of books she had been reading one chapter at a time at the library, because buying them had never been possible. Celia held the stack against her chest and looked at Lenora with an expression that contained too many things to name: gratitude, disbelief, or the particular joy of receiving something you wanted but had trained yourself not to ask for. That night, Celia read until well past midnight, her lamp casting a warm circle on the ceiling of the room they shared, and Lenora lay in the dark, listening to the occasional sound of a page turning, and felt something shift inside her that had been locked in place for years. The sound of her daughter reading in her own bed, with her own books in their own light was, she realized, the sound of a life beginning to unfold rather than contract. She replaced the coffee maker that had stopped working 8 months earlier. She paid the electric bill, the water bill, the overdue balance on the phone plan that had been threatening disconnection for 6 weeks. She paid the past due balance on Martin's school lunch account, on the fee she owed the dentist for Celia's last checkup, the library fine she had been carrying for 4 months, because returning the books on time would have meant returning them before Celia finished reading them. Each payment was small, ordinary, unremarkable to anyone who had never lived without the ability to make it. To Lenora, each one felt like a door opening in a hallway that had been closed for so long she had forgotten how many doors there were. She did not move immediately. The apartment above the hardware store, with its narrow hallway and thin walls and the faucet that dripped in a rhythm she had long since stopped hearing, remained her home for another 3 months. Not because she could not afford to leave, but because leaving required a plan, and plans required thought, and then thought required the kind of stillness that the world was no longer offering her. Reporters still called. Letters arrived from strangers, some kind, some calculating, some openly aggressive in their assumption that her fortune was somehow a shared resource. A man from a distant state wrote to explain that he was a descendant of the Hartwell family, and that the contents of the chamber rightfully belonged to him. Margaret handled the claim swiftly and thoroughly, producing documentation that showed the Hartwell line had ended with Edith, and that the property, along with everything on and beneath it, had passed cleanly through legal channels. The man did not write again. Others were less easily dismissed. A developer contacted Margaret's office with an offer to purchase the lighthouse and surrounding land for an amount that, so while significant, represented a fraction of the property's now established value. The offer was polite, professional, and accompanied by architectural renderings that showed the lighthouse converted into a boutique hotel, its tower topped with a glass-enclosed restaurant, its bluff lined with luxury cabins. Lenora studied the renderings for a long time, not because she was tempted, but because they represented something she needed to see clearly: the vision that other people had for the place she now owned, the way money attracted more money, the way a building that had been worthless to everyone 6 months ago had suddenly become desirable now that someone else had proven it mattered. She declined the offer. She declined every offer that followed, and there were many. The lighthouse was not for sale. It had never been for sale. Not really. It had been for sale only in the way that things are for sale when no one wants them, offered to the world as a formality, a final gesture before abandonment. Lenora had not purchased an investment. She had recognized something that everyone else had missed, and that recognition, more than the deed or the key or the $50, was what made the lighthouse hers. The restoration began in spring. Lenora hired a firm that specialized in historical preservation, a small company based 2 hours north that had spent years working on coastal structures and understood the particular challenges of salt, wind, and time. The lead architect, a man named Thomas, walked the property with her on a morning when the fog was thin enough to let the sun through in long, pale beams. He moved slowly, touching walls, studying mortar joints, while running his hands along the ironwork with the attention of someone reading a language he loved. When he reached the lantern room, he stood at the broken windows and looked out at the same view Lenora had seen on her first visit, the coast stretching in both directions, the sea moving below. He turned to her and said, simply, "This is worth saving." The work took 8 months. Lenora visited every week, sometimes twice, driving the narrowing road with Celia and Martin in the back seat, watching the transformation unfold with the same patience she had brought to every other part of her life. The keeper's quarters were demolished first, the collapsed structure removed and replaced with a new building designed to complement the tower without mimicking it. The new quarters were modest, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room with windows that faced the sea, built with materials that honored the lighthouse's history while providing the comfort and safety that a family required. Thomas walked her through each phase, explaining decisions with the respect of someone who understood that this was her home being built, not merely a project being completed. He showed her the reclaimed timber that would frame the interior walls, sourced from a barn in the next county that had been dismantled the previous year. He showed her the slate that would cover the roof, quarried from the same region that had supplied the original lighthouse stone. Every choice was deliberate, every material selected to bridge the distance between what had been and what would be. Lenora approved each one with the careful attention she had once given to the weekly grocery list, not because the scale was comparable, but because the habit of caring about details did not change with circumstance. It was who she was before the fortune, and it would be who she was after. The workers grew accustomed to her presence. She arrived early, often before the crew, and walked the site with a cup of coffee in one hand and a notebook in the other. She learned their names, asked about their families, brought food on Fridays. She was not performing generosity. She was doing what she had always done, paying attention to the people around her, treating them as real rather than incidental. The crew responded in kind. They worked with a precision that went beyond professional obligation, as if the building they were constructing had absorbed something of its owner's character and demanded the same seriousness in return. One afternoon, near the end of the project, as Lenora stood watching the final window being fitted in the lantern room, Thomas joined her on the bluff. They stood side by side in silence for a while, watching the glass catch the light and throw it back toward the sea. Then Thomas said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "Most buildings are made for people," he said. "This one was made by people for something bigger than themselves. You're continuing that." Lenora looked at him and nodded, and the wind carried his words across the bluff and out over the water, where they joined the countless other things the sea had received and held without judgment. The tower itself was the greater challenge. Masons repaired the stonework, replacing crumbled mortar, stabilizing sections that had shifted over decades of wind exposure. The spiral staircase was reinforced, its iron steps cleaned and treated, its railing restored to the strength it had once possessed. New windows were fitted in the lantern room, thick glass that could withstand the storms that regularly swept the coast, and at Lenora's request, a light was installed, Not the original mechanism, which had long since been removed, but a modern equivalent that cast its beam across the water as the original had done, a signal that the lighthouse had returned to its purpose. The night the light was first turned on, Lenora stood at the base of the tower, with Celia and Martin on either side of her. Thomas and his crew stood behind them, and Margaret had driven from Bridgehaven for the occasion, and Ellis had closed the hardware store early and made the drive without being asked. There was no ceremony, no speeches, no ribbon to cut. Someone flipped a switch inside the tower, and the light appeared at the top, steady and bright, sweeping across the dark water in a slow, measured arc that reached further than any of them could see. Martin whispered something that Lenora did not catch, and Celia gripped her mother's arm, and the small group stood together on the bluff, watching the light do what it had been built to do, what it had waited decades to do again. The moment was not dramatic. It was something quieter and more lasting than drama. It was completion, the closing of a circle that had been open for too long. The sealed chamber was preserved. Lenora insisted on this, and Thomas understood, without needing extensive explanation. The stone slab was replaced with a proper hatch, secured and climate-controlled. The chamber below maintained at the conditions that had kept its contents safe for a century. The chamber itself was empty now. The crates, bundles, and their contents had been transferred to a secure facility under Margaret's supervision. But the space remained, a reminder of what had been hidden and what had been found. Lenora sometimes descended the stairs alone, standing in the cool silence of the chamber, feeling the weight of the stone above her and the sea beyond the walls, grounding herself in the physical reality of the place that had changed everything. The children adapted with the fluid resilience that children possess when they are loved and told the truth. Celia, whose understanding of the situation grew with each passing month, began asking questions that reflected a maturing awareness of what their life had become. She asked about the Hartwells, about the ships that had carried the treasures, about the ocean and its history of loss and recovery. She wrote a school essay about the lighthouse that her teacher read aloud to the class, and when classmates asked questions, Celia answered with a poise that made Lenora's chest ache with pride. Martin adjusted differently, more quietly, in ways that required closer attention to notice. He drew the lighthouse constantly, his renderings growing more detailed with each version. The spiral staircase, the lantern room, the rocks at the base of the bluff, the sea in all its moods. He taped his drawings to the walls of his bedroom in the apartment, then transferred them to the walls of his new room in the keeper's quarters when the family moved in, creating a gallery that charted not only the lighthouse's transformation, but his own. He was still quiet, still cautious, still the boy who watched his mother's face for cues before deciding how to feel. But the cues had changed. The tension that had once lived behind Lenora's eyes, the constant low-grade anxiety that children sense even when adults believe they have hidden it, had loosened, replaced by something steadier, warmer. Martin noticed, and his drawings grew brighter. The move to the lighthouse happened on a Saturday in late autumn, when the light on the coast was golden, and the wind carried the salt smell that Lenora had come to associate with home. They brought only what mattered: clothes, books, Martin's blocks, on Celia's journal, the coffee maker that worked again, the fish-shaped magnet that held Martin's first drawing of the lighthouse to the refrigerator. The truck made 2 trips. The first carried the practical things, boxes labeled in Lenora's handwriting, with the same neat efficiency she had once used to track expenses on the back of envelopes. The second trip carried the things that had no labels: the quilt her grandmother had made, the photograph of Celia and Martin taken on a day when they had all been laughing about something none of them could now remember, a small wooden box that held the folded note from the kitchen counter, the one that said, "I can't do this anymore," kept not as a wound, but as a compass, a reminder of the direction she had chosen to walk away from. When the truck pulled up to the keeper's quarters for the last time, Martin was the first to jump out. He ran to the front door and pressed his palm flat against the wood, as if greeting the building the way you would greet a friend you had been waiting to see. Celia followed more slowly, her eyes moving across the new structure with the appraising gaze of someone old enough to understand that this was not just a house, but a declaration that her mother had built something from nothing, from $50 and a hand raised in a room full of people who had kept theirs down. The apartment above the hardware store was left clean and empty, its doors locked, its keys returned to Birch without ceremony. Lenora did not look back as she drove away. The apartment had been necessary, and it had served its purpose, and she honored it by leaving it exactly as she wished she had found it. Clean, cared for, ready for whoever came next. The town watched the transformation from a distance that gradually narrowed. The lighthouse, visible from the coastal road, became a landmark again, its restored tower visible for miles, its new light sweeping the water each night in a rhythm that older residents recognized and younger ones learned. People drove out to see it, parking at the end of the dirt road that had been graded and graveled as part of the restoration, walking the path to the bluff and looking up at the tower the way Lenora and her children had looked up at it on their first visit. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of something closer to pilgrimage, drawn by the story that had spread far beyond the town's borders and had taken on the quality of myth. A woman, a lighthouse, a fortune, a life remade. And Lenora received visitors when she chose to, and declined when she did not. She had no obligation to perform gratitude or display transformation for an audience. What she offered instead was something quieter and more durable. She established a fund, Margaret's suggestion, refined by Sandra's expertise, that directed a portion of the discovery's value toward the community that had existed around the lighthouse for generations. The fund supported the local school, the library, the volunteer fire department, and a scholarship program for students from families whose circumstances resembled what Lenora's had been. She did not attach her name to the fund. She did not attend ceremonies or accept awards. The money moved through channels she had designed with the same deliberateness that the Hartwells had used to build their chamber. Quietly, effectively, with the understanding that purpose mattered more than recognition. Not everyone in town responded with grace. There were those who questioned whether the discovery should have remained private at all, whether one woman's auction purchase entitled her to a century of accumulated wealth, whether the county itself should have claimed the contents of the chamber as public property. These arguments surfaced in letters to the local paper, in comments at town council meetings, in the low conversations that happened at checkout lines and church parking lots. Lenora heard about them secondhand, usually through Margaret, who tracked public sentiment the way a sailor tracks the wind, not out of fear, but out of the practical necessity of knowing which direction pressure was coming from. One man, a retired attorney named Greer, who had served on the County Planning Commission for 20 years, wrote a formal letter to the state arguing that the lighthouse's contents should be treated as maritime salvage subject to federal jurisdiction. The letter was thorough, well-reasoned, and entirely unsuccessful. Margaret's legal team had anticipated the argument months earlier and had secured opinions from maritime law specialists, confirming that the property's clean title transfer, combined with the elapsed statute of limitations on any potential salvage claims, placed the discovery firmly within Lenora's legal ownership. Greer's letter received a polite acknowledgement and no further action. He did not write again, but his silence carried the particular weight of someone who believed he had been right and resented the world for disagreeing. There were also those who simply could not reconcile what had happened with their understanding of how the world worked. A woman who owned the bakery on Main Street, someone Lenora had never spoken to directly, told a reporter that the whole thing felt wrong, that ordinary people did not find $300 million under a floor, that there must be more to the story. The quote was published without context, and it circulated online with the speed and indifference of all things that confirm what people already want to believe. Lenora read it once, set the newspaper down, and didn't read it again. The bakery owner's discomfort was not Lenora's responsibility. Disbelief, she had learned, was often just another form of grief. The mourning of a world that turned out to be more surprising than expected. The reactions in town continued to evolve beyond those early sharp edges. Diane, who had rewritten history to include herself in Lenora's success, eventually settled into a version of the story she could live with, and repeated it often enough that it began to feel true to her. Lenora did not correct her. The energy required to challenge someone else's narrative was energy she preferred to spend elsewhere, and the truth, she had learned, did not require defense. It simply existed, steady and unbothered, like the lighthouse itself. Her mother visited for the first time on a Sunday in early winter. She arrived in a car driven by Lenora's brother, who lived 3 states away, and had sent a single text message when the news broke. "Proud of you, sis." And nothing since. Her mother walked through the keeper's quarters slowly, touching surfaces, opening cabinets, standing at the window that overlooked the sea with an expression Lenora had never seen on her face before. It was not pride, exactly, and it was not relief. It was something closer to the recognition that the world contained possibilities she had not accounted for, that her daughter had walked a path she could not have imagined, and arrived somewhere she could not have predicted. She turned from the window and looked at Lenora, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then her mother crossed the room and held her, tightly, without words, and Lenora let herself be held, feeling the smallness of the gesture against the largeness of everything that had happened, and understanding that some things did not need to match in scale to be enough. The lighthouse settled into its new life as the seasons turned. For winter brought storms that tested the restoration's integrity, and the tower held, as it had held for over a century, its walls absorbing the wind's force and returning it as silence. Spring softened the bluff with wildflowers that Celia cataloged in a notebook she kept by the front door. Summer brought warmth and visitors, and the long, bright evenings that turned the sea to copper and gold. Autumn returned the light to its gentler angles, and the lighthouse cast its shadow across the bluff in the late afternoon, a dark shape on the ground that Lenora sometimes stood inside, feeling the outline of the tower around her like an embrace. She still worked. Not at the cafeteria or the laundromat, those chapters had closed, but at the lighthouse itself, maintaining the grounds, overseeing the preservation of the tower, managing the small details that kept a historical property alive. She hired a part-time groundskeeper, a young man from town named Jesse, who had been struggling to find steady employment after his father's construction company closed. She paid him fairly and treated him with the same unremarkable respect that Ellis had once shown her, understanding now that small acts of decency were not gestures, but infrastructure, the invisible framework that held communities together when nothing else would. She also began a project she had been thinking about since the discovery, working with the County Historical Society and a maritime museum 2 hours north. She helped establish a permanent exhibition dedicated to the Hartwell family and the lighthouse's history. The exhibition told the full story: the lighthouse's construction, the generations of keepers who had maintained it, the salvage operations that had accumulated the fortune, Edith's solitary years guarding what she could never reveal. Lenora contributed items from the collection: coins, documents, a selection of the shipping manifests that told the story of loss and recovery that had played out along the coast for decades. She did so not out of obligation, but out of the same instinct that had driven her to preserve the chamber itself. The past deserved to be seen, and seeing it required someone willing to open the door. The exhibition opened on a Saturday in early autumn, and the museum was fuller than it had been in years. People drove from neighboring counties, from the city, from places Lenora had never heard of. They moved through the displays slowly, reading the placards, studying the photographs, and standing before the glass cases that held coins and manifests and a single gold bar that Lenora had donated as the centerpiece. She watched them from the back of the room, her children beside her, and she felt something she had not expected. Not pride, not satisfaction, but a sense of rightness, of alignment, as though the story had been waiting for this particular telling and had finally found the voice it needed. She also began writing, not for publication, not for an audience, but for her children, for the record, for the same impulse that had driven the Hartwells to catalog what they collected. She wrote about the auction, the key, the first drive down the narrowing road. She wrote about the sealed stone and the cold air that rose from beneath it. She wrote about Gordon Pierce and his number, about Margaret and her steady hands, and about Ellis and his quiet recommendation. She wrote about the shoes Martin needed, and the inhaler refill she could not afford, and the $12 that had once been the measure of her survival. She wrote about all of it, not because the story was remarkable, though it was, but because the person who had lived it deserved to remember that she had been strong before the fortune, during the fortune, and would remain strong after the headlines faded and the world moved on to its next amazement. Martin's drawings continued to multiply. The lighthouse in rain, in sun, in fog, at night with its light sweeping the water. He drew it from every angle, in every season, as if he were trying to capture something that could not be held in a single image. One evening, as Lenora stood in the lantern room watching the light begin its rotation, she heard his footsteps on the stairs behind her. He climbed the last few steps and stood beside her, his face turned toward the window, the beam passing over them both in its slow, steady arc. He did not speak. He reached for her hand and held it, his small fingers wrapping around hers with the grip of someone who had found something he did not intend to let go. They stood there together as the light moved and the sea darkened and the stars emerged one by one, filling the sky above the coast with the same patterns that had guided ships and keepers and dreamers for longer than anyone could count. The lighthouse held them both, solid and warm, restored and purposeful, and the night settled around them with the kindness of something that had waited a very long time to be inhabited again. Below them, the chamber rested in its sealed quiet, so empty now of gold and silver and gemstones, but full of something less tangible and more enduring, the memory of what had been hidden, and the knowledge of what hiding had cost and what revealing had given. The stone floor that Lenora had swept with a borrowed broom, the seam she had traced with her fingers, the cold air that had risen from a century of darkness. All of it remained, not as treasure, but as testimony. Proof that the things the world overlooks are not always the things the world should forget. Lenora did not think of herself as lucky. Luck implied accident, and what had happened to her wasn't accidental. It was the result of a decision made in a basement courtroom by a woman who raised her hand when no one else would, who saw possibility in a building that others saw only as ruin, who drove a dirt road because she had run out of paved ones and kept going anyway. The fortune beneath the lighthouse had not fallen into her lap. She had climbed down to it, one stone step at a time, alone in the dark, carrying nothing but a flashlight and the stubborn belief that something worth finding existed in the places everyone else had abandoned. That belief had been the most expensive thing she owned long before the gold. It had cost her sleep and dignity and the quiet approval of people who measured worth in ways she could not afford. It had been tested by every overdue notice, every sideways glance, every conversation that ended too quickly when she entered the room. And it had held. Not because she was special, and not because she was certain, but because giving it up would have meant giving up the only thing poverty could not take from her, the knowledge that her life was worth the effort of living it. The lighthouse light turned above her, sweeping the dark water with its beam, reaching out toward ships that might never pass, and shorelines that might never need its guidance. It did not matter. The light turned because that was what lighthouses did. They stood at the edge, and they shone, and they did not ask whether anyone was watching. Lenora understood this. She had been doing it for years. Spring arrived again, the second spring since the discovery, and the bluff around the lighthouse erupted in color. Wildflowers pushed through the thinning soil, their roots finding purchase in the rocky ground, their blossoms small and vivid against the gray-green brush. And Celia mapped them, learning their names, pressing samples between the pages of books she had once read at the library and now owned. Martin painted them, mixing colors on a palette Lenora had bought him, his brush strokes growing more confident with each attempt. The lighthouse stood among the flowers like something that had always been part of the landscape, and perhaps it had been. Perhaps it had simply been waiting, as all overlooked things wait, for someone to notice that it was still there. Lenora walked the bluff in the early mornings, before the children woke, before the day made its demands. The sea was calmest then, its surface catching the first light and holding it, and the air carried the salt and the cold and the particular silence of a world that had not yet remembered it was supposed to be noisy. She walked to the edge of the bluff and looked down at the rocks below, where the waves met the land in a conversation that had been going on since before anyone was alive to hear it. She thought about Edith Hartwell, alone in the quarters for 15 years, guarding a secret she could not share. She thought about the ships that had carried the gold, the storms that had sunk them, the hands that had recovered what the sea had tried to keep. She thought about the auction, the clerk who did not look up, the key that was heavier than it should have been. And she thought about the woman who had sat in the back row of a basement courtroom, a woman with rough hands and an empty bank account, and 2 children who had learned not to ask for things, a woman who had raised her hand because a lighthouse looked the way she felt. Abandoned. I overlooked, still standing for reasons no one could explain. She thought about that woman, and she thanked her. Not aloud, not in words, but in the way she lived each day that followed, with attention, with care, with the quiet understanding that the most valuable things in life are not the ones that glitter in the dark, but the ones that make you climb down to see them for yourself. One evening, as the last light of the day turned the water to a deep amber, Celia found her mother standing on the bluff. She had come up from the keeper's quarters with a blanket over her shoulders and 2 cups of tea she had made herself, carrying them with the careful seriousness of an 11-year-old who understood that some moments deserved contribution rather than observation. She handed 1 cup to Lenora and stood beside her, and for a while they said nothing, watching the horizon darken and the first stars appear. "Mom," Celia said eventually, her voice quiet against the wind. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't raised your hand?" Lenora looked at her daughter, at the face that held so much of her own and so much that was entirely new, and she thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. "Every day," she said, "and every day I'm glad I did." Celia nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected, and they stood together as the lighthouse light began its rotation above them, sweeping the darkening water with a steady, unhurried rhythm that asked nothing and offered everything. The lighthouse light turned, the sea moved, the children slept, and Lenora stood at the edge, as she had always stood. So she would continue to stand, not because she had been given a reason to, but because she had always been the kind of person who stood at edges and looked out, believing, against all evidence, that something worth seeing waited just beyond where the light could reach. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.